All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to the Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick here, we're doing our preview and prediction for the Iowa Hawkeyes. Looking at this staff, Kirk Ferentz, 204 and 124 record since 1999. He's been the lead man for well over 25 years now. Tim Lester, second year in the role as offensive coordinator. Phil Parker, he's also been on the staff since 1999. He'll be in his patented defensive coordinator role once again. Looking at the offseason, 64th in the portal, top 40 high school cycle. 8-5 with a loss in the Music City Bowl, and I had a bet on them. They hit the over in wins on the regular season. They slightly missed that one. A respectable team nonetheless. Getting things started on offense. The Hawkeyes last year, Nick, they actually had a pretty normal offense for their standards, 28 points per game. And, of course, that was headed by Caleb Johnson, who was just a superstar at running back, over 1,500 yards, 21 touchdowns. He now departs, though, and, of course, you get a complete revamp in the quarterback room. So they're going to have to start from scratch once again, and that means the expectations are certainly going to be significantly lower because the passing attack was still one of the worst in the country, and just one player elevated them so well running the football. You go to Mark Gronowski at quarterback. This is a coveted transfer from South Dakota State. A couple of successful seasons there at 6'3", 230. This guy has size, nice physicality to thrive as a runner, shows good touch on downfield throws. He throws a nice, tight fastball. I think navigates the pocket quite well. He's got a bit of a slower release, though. Can he fire in the tight windows in conference play? Are kind of the concerns here. And Nick, one thing that we talked about is, there's a reason why you ended up at Iowa, because I thought this guy was, again, coveted out of the portal, but it doesn't seem like he was. He instantly committed to Iowa. He said this was a cultural fit for him, and that's what's best. He had a visit to Miami. He ended up canceling to instead commit to Iowa. Now, this just does not make a whole lot of sense to me, and it's no disrespect to him from us, but maybe how the college football world views him, because there's a reason why you ended up at Iowa, because I thought this was a pretty good player. And again, if you had a Miami visit who just had a quarterback throw for 1 billion yards and go number one in the draft, why would you not want to go down that hole? And this is when they still needed a quarterback. I would have been loving to take a visit there and see what they have to offer. Instead, he ends up here where you're not going to have many weapons. The run game is going to certainly regress a good bit. Why is Gronowski at Iowa? Is he just not that good?
If you're trying to elevate your stock as a quarterback to get drafted, early in the NFL draft, I don't think Iowa is the place to do so. No disrespect to what Iowa has done. There have been a pretty great program over the past 25 years or so under their coach. They've been able to produce, 10-win seasons and a really strong defense, but the offense has been an issue. In the couple of years I've been doing this podcast with you, when we do the stats for the previous year for Iowa, basically every single stat is in the 130th or 131st, something like that in the nation, the FBS. Rarely do I see a stat that's above 130th in the nation for this year. There's two of them, one at 72nd in the nation in points per game, and last year their running attack was really good. Their rushing attack was great, so they were 24th in the nation. An impressive number there, but I don't really understand why Gronowski went to Iowa here. Maybe there's something sneaky about him not being able to reach the higher heights than he already has. Saying that maybe his ceiling has already been hit and he's capped out. His 2023 was quite strong for South Dakota State, 68% comp rate, 3,000 yards passing, 29 touchdowns to 5 interceptions. In addition to some rushing touchdowns, he had 8 of those and 400 yards. Last year he regressed. 2024 he regressed. He saw an 8% dip in his comp rate, 2,700 yards passing, 23 touchdowns and 7 interceptions. The only stat that really improved for him was he had 2 more rushing touchdowns, saw a dip in his yards by about 20 last year on the ground as well. He's regressed. I think there's no way to hide that. He's slightly regressed here. And maybe you're concerned if you're, in Miami, you're looking at that and saying, hey, this is a quarterback that's going backwards, not forward, making the jump up from the FCS level to Iowa here. The fit, I don't know if it's really going to work. This is a kid that's, pretty accurate at times. We saw that in 2023, but the accuracy was weaker last year. He was inaccurate at times, made some mistakes, was a little uncomfortable. He did fight for some tough touchdowns, right? He is a kid that can fight hard. I think he's got a solid frame, 6'3", 230, a good arm strength, good field vision, and some solid football IQ, but I just don't know if I trust the fit here. I feel like Iowa doesn't really work for him. I feel like he doesn't really work for Iowa. It just seems to be a weird marriage. When I saw that out of the portal, I was a bit confused about this ad across the board. Curious to see how it's going to turn out, but like you said, he doesn't really have any weapons to work with, and the rushing attack is going to absolutely drop this year since they lost their top back in Caleb Johnson. Curious to see what this offense is going to look like, and curious to see what this quarterback can do in this system.
Yeah, I think USC was also in on him early as well. So, there were some pretty notable spots he probably could have went to. He ends up at Iowa. I'm just starting to think that some scouts and whatnot and coaches didn't start to like what they saw on him, and that's why he ends up here at Iowa. So we're going to go ahead and look at this rushing attack that has to replace that Caleb Johnson. Kamari Moulton had 2 great games late in the year. This guy's a smooth runner. I like his burst, runs low with some urgency, delivering some good pop to defenders. Jason Patterson also brought some good games to the table. Nathan McNeil, a freshman from Florida, might operate as a number 3. Depth seems quite limited, but they have a solid 1-2 punch here. Should provide good production. And, of course, look at the O-line. I think it's a pretty respectable unit. So I think their run game will be good. But Caleb Johnson was just so darn good for them, Nick. And, of course, this offense really folded in the few games where they weren't able to run the football. It was just a couple of them. Michigan State, UCLA, Nebraska are some examples there. What do you think the production is going to look like this fall?
Bolton has huge shoes to fill for this offense. Losing Caleb Johnson is certainly no joke. They were almost at 200 yards per game on the ground last year, top 25 unit in the nation, like I said, but they have to replace the bulk of that production. I thought Bolton was good as the number 2 back last year, 475, 5.6 yards per attempt, and 3 scores for about 40 yards per game in his 84 touches. He's going to see a lot more than that this year. He'll see probably closer to 150 touches this year. He's going to have to find a way to see if he can keep that sort of production. If he can keep that 5.6 yards per attempt, I think Iowa will be pretty happy with that production. I don't know if he'll be able to sustain that sort of average on the ground per touch this season. The depth is very limited there, although I do think the freshman they brought in from Florida could be a very interesting prospect to kind of develop and see what they can do here. It certainly relies on the O-line. If the O-line is strong and producing, then I think this rushing attack will still be really solid, but I think there is certainly a dip in production that should be expected based off losing such a star back in Johnson.
Let's go to the wide receiver group. Jacob Gill was the leading pass catcher, had 3 games of 40-plus yards, spent time in the slot and out wide. Reese Vanderzee at 6'4", 207 had 2 good games across the 9 he played last season as a freshman. Seth Anderson had 16 receptions so far in 2 seasons. He'll be in the starting lineup. Sam Phillips, a pretty good ad from Chattanooga. Very impressive player, 5'9", 185, had 2 100-yard games in year 3 with them, mostly played outside wide receiver. And then, of course, they have a nice tight end, Addison Ostrenga. Been quite productive in his career, will be one of the top target getters now that he is going to be the full starting tight end. And then, of course, they have a guy behind him in Zach Ortworth, who will be a really good pass blocker. At least that's what he's been so far in his career. Not much to talk about here, Nick, with the weapons. I mean, they just don't seem to have anybody. They never seriously try to get anybody either. Disappointing as always.
Yeah, disappointing. I think there are some promising players here. I don't want to rag on these guys too bad. I think, Jacob Gill is not a terrible player, about 400 yards receiving for him last year and 2 scores, while Vanderzee had 3 receiving touchdowns on his limited 14 grabs last year, 176 total yards. Seth Anderson will get some more targets this year. He had 100 yards receiving last year on limited catches. While the 2 tight ends, Ostrenga and Ortworth, I think they're 2 interesting prospects. They have both about 100 yards. Ostrenga might be more of a target in the red zone this year. He only played in 8 games last year. To see what a full workload looks like for him. Nothing, really to write home about here. Obviously, this is Iowa after all we're talking about here, but I don't think this is the worst unit in the world for them compared to some previous units in the past. I think some of the potential of these guys is not terrible, and I'm curious to see how it develops throughout the season.
Yeah, I would agree. It's certainly not as bad as it's been in the past. Looking at the offensive line, Jack Dolzer in his 3rd season is going to step in to start at left tackle, 6'6", 305 pounds. Bayou Stevens, a 6'6", 322, was a tremendous player at left guard for them. They have one of the nation's best centers, I feel like, in Logan Jones. He was an elite player, allowed only 5 pressures, and was also a very good run blocker. Cade Kuiper has some big shoes to fill at right guard. He'll need to keep adding size. He was only 275 pounds last fall, but he really impressed when he was on the field. Veteran Jennings Dunker's back at right tackle. He was a phenomenal run blocker, allowed only 1 sack in conference play. I think this is a really good offensive line. They paved the way for Caleb Johnson to have that insane season. I thought coming into the year they're going to be pretty good, but I'd say they exceeded my expectations, and with the veteran presence coming back, and this normally being a position they coach very well, I think they'll do very sound. Of course, they do replace a left tackle and a right guard. That was very good for them, Nick, but I'm not worried one bit. I think they'll be stout here up front.
I think they'll be solid up front. I like what they have here. Logan Jones at center is a really talented player who's a good leader for this team. Cade Piper, obviously one of the younger players on this offensive line at right guard, but I still think he's a really solid player that can certainly develop. Steffens, I think, is really good at left guard. Dutlitzer is really solid at left tackle as well. And then Dunker is really good at right tackle, a guy that's been around the program for a while as well. This O-line, I think, is really solid. I think it will be a good unit again, one of the better ones in the conference.
Hawkeyes offensive verdict. They overachieved in offense last season as Johnson carried them immensely. I think they have a solid duo at running back. It will be hard to match those numbers, of course. The addition of Gronowski could give this offense some more juice, but I think anything is possible with this great offensive line in front of them. I think this is a pretty respectable unit for the Hawkeye standards. I'm going to give them a B-, Nick, and it's typically a C+, and I know we had an F in there one year, so they're getting better year to year, but of course the ceiling's certainly still going to be low.
The ceiling is capped here. I think this offense is interesting. I think the Gronowski ad was interesting for them. I will say they also added Hank Brown from Auburn. Remember when Auburn fans thought that kid was the future after a good showing against New Mexico? Those were funny times. Curious to see what type of depth he provides. Maybe he'll be involved at some point, but I don't think Brown's a phenomenal prospect or anything at this moment in time. I do think the rushing attack will take a step back, but I think Moulton's a good back. They potentially have some room to grow. And the wide receiver room is one of the better ones that Iowa's had in the past, 5 or 10 years or so. So I don't think it's all doom and gloom, but this is still a weak offense that will certainly regress this year.
Looking at the defensive side of the ball for Iowa, they return 4 starters. Best news is they get back their top 3 sack getters. Coming off the edge, Ethan Herkett, 260-pounder, was great versus the run as well. 11.5 TFL. Max Llewellyn, despite being a second stringer, was an incredible pass rusher. He had that game-winning strip sack versus Nebraska in the season finale. Kenneth Merriweather, Joseph Anderson, 2 young guys who didn't see the field last fall. They have an interior defensive line. They returns Aaron Graves, a 6'4", 300. He was a very impressive pass rusher, did well versus the run as well. Jeremiah Pittman, 6'3", 293. Wasn't all that good. He was near 250 snaps. Will Hubert barely played last fall, 285-pound player, entering his 4th season in the program. They also picked up Jonah Pace, 6'5", 285 from Central Michigan. Pretty solid run defender as well this past season for them. Bryce Hawthorne comes over from South Dakota State, 285-pounder. Iowa doesn't dip in the portal frequently, but clearly thinks they have some good upside in these 2, Nick. So even though they're coming from less notable schools, they must be able to be some type of asset here. I think the defensive line will be great. You get your top 3 sack getters. Of course, Iowa's always a wealth of experience up front, and this is kind of for them an embarrassment of riches. These are some good players here.
Yeah, this is some solid unit here. I really like what they have here. Ethan Herkett, obviously, is your big headliner here. 56 total tackles, 12 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks, 3 forced fumbles. Really good numbers from him. He's a very strong player there. I think he'll be really good this year. Aaron Graves was solid for this team last year as well. 33 total tackles, 8 tackles for loss, 6 sacks for him, 3 pass breakups, 3 forced fumbles. I think he's really solid. Max Llewellyn was okay at times. 22 total tackles, 8 tackles for loss, 5.5 sacks, 3 pass breakups. He's a really good asset coming off on the edge there. And Jeremiah Pittman was not good last year, but hopeful that they can see an improvement from him. He's hoping he can step up and be a little bit better of an asset. 17 total tackles, 2 tackles for loss. I think that Jonah Pace adds phenomenal. I think Pace is a really good player who showed some progress last year at Central Michigan and improved throughout the season. 6'5", 285 from him. 34 total tackles, 11 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, and 6 QB hurries last year. Had a really good game against NIU towards the end of the season. Also had a strong game against Bowling Green with 1.5 sacks and 2.5 TFLs. I think that was a really solid ad for Iowa.
Now you look at the middle of this defense, it's a complete overhaul at linebacker. As both top players who've been productive for a couple of seasons depart. Jaden Harrell only saw a significant amount of reps versus UCLA, has spent numerous years in the program. Same goes for Carson Shaw. Limited reps in his career, but he's been in the program for years. Jackson Rexroth, 6'2", 226. All 3 of these players are redshirt seniors with very little playing time to their name. For most programs, this would be a major concern, right? And I think for Iowa, it could certainly be an issue maybe early on, but with Phil Parker's guidance, I'm really not all that worried. It's just, via strong coaching. This is how they operate their program, right? These guys never really see the field to get on, and they excel in their roles. Early on, though, I do think they'll struggle a little bit, but it's not going to be anything season long that I'm really too worried about.
Yeah, I think this is a unit that will continue to grow throughout the season. I'm not too worried about it. Sure, they don't have a whole lot of experience. I think Jaden Harrell's a really good player that they have here that they can certainly lead the way. Not a whole lot of stats from these guys. These guys have not played a whole lot. They're definitely further down the depth chart in previous years, but I think this is a linebacking core that will improve as the season goes on. You trust the coaching here. You trust these guys to step up and be involved in this defense. I have no concerns with this linebacking core.
I move to the secondary for Iowa. I would say they underwhelmed last fall. I wasn't very impressed with what they put on the field. They do return 2 veteran corners into Sean Lee, TJ Hall. Neither of these guys really impressed, but taking over for the departing Jamari Harris won't be a simple task. Youth behind them in Jalen Watson, Rashad Godfrey. Xavier Nwakpa has been solid in his career, the X5 star safety. Plays the game the right way, understands the scheme. Limited ball production, though, through 3 seasons, 2 picks and 3 pass breakups. Cohen Intringer was pretty good in his snaps last fall. He's expected to fill the role left by Sebastian Castro. Mostly vets are going to be here in the starting lineup. Another group we're not all that worried as this is a well-coached cover 2 shell. I like the DB department overall. It's nothing that I'm really raving home about, though, Nick. But again, it is Iowa, so even though the guys on tape probably don't scream, crazy upside right now, they're probably going to end up playing very well. Returning ball production isn't very ideal, though, and the 2 veterans I have at corner I wasn't impressed with last season. So maybe this is a step-back opportunity.
Maybe a step back opportunity. I think, Deshaun Lee was weak at times last year. 42 total tackles, a tackle for loss, a pick, 4 pass breakups for him. And Nopqua was solid at times. 41 total tackles, a pass breakup for him. I apologize if I butchered that name. TJ Hall, 19 total tackles for him, 2 pass breakups. He was okay for this team in the secondary. I think he's a player that's not bad. Ellen Tringer as well was not bad. 18 total tackles and a pass breakup. But this is still a weaker unit by Iowa standards here. I think the corners in Hall and Lee, they have some work to do. Certainly, I worry about those corners as well. But I trust the coaching, and then they can develop into a good unit as the season goes on.
Look at the verdict for this side of the ball. Not much star power across this defense. Is returning for 25, and at times the group underwhelmed, going 0 for 3 when allowing over 400 yards. This D-line brings back some great producers, while the linebacking group is very quiet with limited notes. You can be certain they will be sound. The secondary, on the other hand, has plenty of snaps to his name. They're also pretty underwhelming. This will be a good defense, but the ceiling is really unclear at the moment. I'm going to go ahead and just be respectful and give them an A-, Nick. I think this staff has earned that with 2 decades of excellence. But they really underwhelmed at times last year. Michigan State had almost 500 yards on them for no reason. UCLA, they had over 400 of great balance in that one. A couple of other times throughout the season, the defense was lackluster. Of course, they didn't look good against Ohio State. Nobody really does. And then they looked awful in the second half against Iowa State. They ended up blowing that game badly. So this side of the ball really did underwhelm Nick, and it's really going to be hard to expect them to be better with all this inexperience across the table.
I think there's a lot of inexperience here, which is certainly concerning. I give this unit a B+ right now because it's a high upside unit, right? There's a lot of potential here, but that's what it is. It's potential, not a whole lot of experience. We haven't seen these guys play really at all. That linebacking core is all guys that have limited experience in the secondary. I was concerned about the corners last year. Hall and Lee, I think, were both weak. Love the D-line, right? Very experienced unit there that will certainly help out this defense a lot. They'll be strong against the run this year, probably better than they were last year. But the secondary worries me a little bit here. I think his regression is coming for that secondary unit. And the inexperienced linebackers certainly give me some pause for concern here. A little bit shaky in that unit.
Now I move to the schedule and the prediction for Iowa. Same old new year with the Hawkeyes. They should have a stout defense. While the offense will look to provide some cohesion, it's certainly possible with a great O-line and a run game that should be solid. Very excited to see how Gronowski performs in his move to FBS. Always dangerous, but never taken serious, and the higher-end opponents definitely won't. They've not been scary for the higher-end opponents for a couple of years now, Nick. I have a prediction. This is going to be Kirk Ferentz's final season, either in 25 or 26. He's going to call it quits as he approaches 70 years old. Iowa isn't getting burned much in this new era, but the program's best days of success, I think, are clearly behind them. I just think this is a year where it falls apart for Iowa, where the defense takes too many steps back, where they can't just carry like they typically do on that side of the ball in special teams and the offense, even though I think it'll be, a unit that can put up, 22 points per game. You need more than that at some point. I think this is a year we're just going to see it collapse. This is a tough schedule. People can try and convince me they're going to beat these opponents. Usually this is a home field advantage, but again, against the elite opponents, who are you scaring? Oregon, Penn State? No. Indiana, I think, maybe your best shot because they might be the weakest of the trio in the trenches. I just don't see it, Nick. This is a team that can grind it out and beat anybody, of course, but this is the year where they're going to need more than that to get the job done.
I think this is going to be a tough year for Iowa. I think, Kirk is certainly getting closer to hanging up and calling it quits on what was a phenomenal career, a legendary career in college football. This is a tough schedule, certainly. I have them at 5-7. I think they will beat Wisconsin on the road at Camp Randall. I just don't think Wisconsin will be a phenomenal team this year. That's more on Wisconsin than on Iowa here. Although I could certainly see this team having, 3 losses, or 3 wins, that is, by the end time this is all said and done. They could lose to Minnesota or Michigan State at home. Those are 2 teams that could certainly get the better of them on any given Saturday. I think the ceilings for both those teams are significantly higher than Iowa here. I think the offense will take a step back, which will certainly be a problem. And the defense is unproven and untested. I don't think they're going to compete with the tough teams this year. I think they will get blown out by those bigger teams, mainly Oregon, Penn State. I think they're also going to struggle against Indiana. I wouldn't be surprised if Indiana wins that game by a significant margin at Nebraska as well. I think they'll find themselves in some trouble even if they did beat Nebraska last year. This is a tough year for Iowa. I think this is going to be when the wheels start to kind of fall off. I do agree with your assessment there. I just think, regression is coming and it's imminent for this team. They lost a bowl game last year. They showed some life towards the second half of the season last year, and they certainly can do so again this year. I'm just not counting on it here. I'm going to play it safe here, go with 5-7. Just a tough year for Iowa, but again, it's sort of what you have to deal with sometimes with the ups and downs with this type of program, with the style of play that they play. You're due to regress it occasionally and have a bad season here and there. No shame in that. Just rebuild and hopefully have a better 2026.
And this is a team, Nick, the last time they went 4-8 was 2012. Since then, they've won 7 or more games every single season. They typically hit 8 or more every single year. The COVID year, they went 6-2. They would have certainly hit that number if they had the required games played. So 4-8 is a very bold prediction, something they never even come close to sniffing, Nick, because even before that, they never even sniffed 4 wins. when they went 4-8 in 2012. But I think it's going to happen here. I just think they're going to fall off a cliff at some point, and that's going to be in 2025. Hate to do that, and I'm certainly rooting for him, but I think Ferentz at some point is just going to check out, and I do think that he'll be done coaching within the next year or so.
It's certainly disappointing for Iowa. They've been to a bowl game the last 10 plus seasons. They've really had a nice bowl streak here. Since 2013, they've been a bowl game every single season, including a trip to the Rose Bowl in 2015. But I think this year is the year that streak finally ends, and they find themselves out of a bowl game. I think the schedule is just too tough combined with a weaker offense this year. I'm certainly worried about that for them.
That's it for today's episode. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.